All right, hello everybody. Today I've got something for you. I was trying to get this done while they were still doing their fall thingamajig campaign drive, but Mises Institute has recently released a book which is a collection of Hayek essays. It's called Hayek for the 21st Century, Essays in Political Economy. Not philosophy. I was going to say philosophy. Anyway, it is. They sent me a copy. You can get your own copy too for free. They actually are printing like 100,000 copies of this or something like that. They said in some press release. They're printing a bunch of them and they're giving them out for free. So I'll put a link in the description where you can go to get a copy of this book. This sounds like something you might want to look into. And of course, I'll try to explain why I think it's worth looking at. So Hayek is one of the three greats in Austrian theory in the 20th century. Mises, Rothbard, Hayek. They're the three biggest names, and they're all a little bit different, right? Mises was still clinging on to classical liberalism and trying to kind of reconcile his economic conclusions with kind of a minarchist state. Rothbard made advances in monopoly theory and also, threw away the need for a minarchist state. And Hayek is a weird one because Hayek Hayek was earlier than Rothbard, so there's that too. But Hayek, while influenced by Mises, was a lot more kind of relaxed, I would say, or just kind of gentle. He has a very gentle tone in a way, like in the sense that he's not shouting from the rooftops that this is the way it ought to be. He's kind of very much looking at, people as they are and people wanting, coercive states around them and kind of being unable to stop clinging to them for, somewhat understandable reasons. And so Hayek's work is actually a lot more accessible if you're coming from a mainstream kind of perspective. And that's a good thing too. Rothbard is a bit of a bitter pill if you still harbor some kind of statist sympathies. And Mises is hard to read, but there's something lyrical about the way that Mises writes. Like he's got that German difficulty in his writing, the complexity, but also there's something very poetic about the way that Mises actually puts sentences and paragraphs together. Rothbard is a lot more earthy. He is a lot easier to read most of the time, a lot more fun oftentimes. Hayek is a lot more like Mises, but without the lyricalness that Mises has. And so I personally find Hayek to be the toughest of these three to read. Despite that fact, Hayek was extremely influential, and he, like I said, he was the Austrian who got closest to the mainstream, including a Nobel Prize. Now, if you actually read Hayek's books in full, his conclusions are often fairly squishy from a libertarian perspective. And it's kind of hard to tell whether or not this was like a ploy to get his works to spread further and kind of move the ideas along with people who are more on the fence or even on the other side of the fence. Hopefully get more people to read, and then get the people who are kind of, ooh, this is good, to go further on and read some of the more radical Austrian works. Maybe. But the thing about Hayek is that despite his squishiness, if you look carefully, there are some very important elements of his writing that, I guess you would say, plant the seeds of a stateless society in familiar soil, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to talk about this book. It's got 7 essays, an introduction, a bibliography, and an index. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one, the index least of all, but I'll say something. First off, we'll start with the introduction. The introduction is written by Tom DiLorenzo, of course, extremely accomplished Austrian scholar. And he talks about how, in a way, the 20th century was Hayek's century. It was said to be Hayek's century by people in the 20th century. But at the same time, DiLorenzo kind of laments that Hayek's contributions, while important, still weren't exhausted, weren't taken into account in a lot of cases, and that Hayek still has cogent answers to a lot of the questions that we might have today, or that governments might have today. In the introduction, he gives kind of an overview of the contents, why they picked certain essays and stuff like that. Talks a little bit about the knowledge problem, which is one of Hayek's most important contributions, as well as Hayek's kind of unceasing work against various socialist garbage, Keynes, Galbraith, etc. So the introduction, of course, Tom DiLorenzo is an excellent writer. Perfectly good introduction here. Let's move on to the first essay. So the first essay is called The Intellectuals and Socialism, and it's kind of an interesting choice for the first essay, and I'll explain why a little bit later. This essay is about how intellectuals, by Hayek's kind of odd definition, are contributing to the promotion of socialism in modern-day statecraft. And Hayek's definition of intellectual is a little weird. He includes not just, teachers, professors, journalists, but also radio commentators, writers of fiction, cartoonists, and artists, end quote. If he were writing today, he would probably include influencers in that list. To Hayek, intellectuals are not necessarily the most intelligent people, but what they are is they're second-hand dealers in ideas. I believe that's a quote. I might be butchering it slightly. And the idea is that they don't actually produce the ideas, like capitalism, socialism, whatever, but what they do is they promote certain perceptions of those ideas to a wider audience. That's their function. What Hayek does in this essay is he shows us, and I'm saying this on a freaking, video that's going to go on the internet, he shows us the importance of trying our best to clearly and positively package ideas like Hayek's, like Mises, like Rothbard's for general consumption. If no one else does it, then everybody is just going to simply get these socialist ideas secondhand from these idiots that don't really know what they're promoting. And, based on what Hayek says here, the conclusion that I got is that, we need to push along all of these fronts, and we cannot neglect any of them. We cannot simply, be writers of fiction and let all the artists be socialists. We cannot simply have commentary and let all the subtlety go to the socialists, right? The more people have been convinced of things by Atlas Shrugged than possibly by Man, Economy, and State, however sad that fact is. One of the things that we have that I think might give us a little bit of advantage is our understanding of the division of labor. This is something that actually requires you to have a solid understanding of basic economic principles in order to understand how the division of labor works. And, well, I'm not necessarily a particularly good example of following the division of labor. Here I am with 21 subscribers or something like that. But the point is that we need to see if we can find our niches and promote this kind of stuff as best we can. To be fair, in my writings, my fiction writings, I try to promote kind of in as unheavy-handed a way as possible, kind of a libertarian, stateless kind of feel to it, without bonking people over the head with it. So be it. And I think that that one of the people in the liberty movement and the anarchism movement that we really need to maintain, that we need to pay attention to and really need to appreciate, for instance, is Michael Malice, right? He's kind of, I think paragon is too strong a word, but he's a good example of what Hayek thinks we need to keep socialism from gaining ground. Now, nitty-gritty theorists are great, but at the same time, they rarely convince anybody outside of, other abstract theorists. So, that's another thing to note, is that even though it feels sometimes like the market is saturated, we don't yet have 1,000 Michael Malices, and 1,000 might be fewer than we actually need. And so, something to kind of try to aim for, if you can, right? Be more like Michael Malice in some ways. But, the basic lesson is keep trying, keep writing, keep thinking, keep presenting, and keep a perspective that regular people can understand. And, avoid bonking them over the head with our ideas. That's kind of what I get out of this first essay. All right, the second essay in this collection is a doozy. It is my favorite and my most cited Hayek essay of all time. It's called Why the Worst Get on Top, and it not originally, but it eventually was published as Chapter 10 of Hayek's rather squishy Road to Serfdom book. Now, in a book that was willing to tolerate things like taxation, regulation, welfare state, etc., this essay, or chapter, however you want to think of it, is one of the most powerful seeds for anarchism or voluntary government ever written. If the conclusions of this essay are correct, then it teaches us that we must always look with suspicion upon states that are long-term, that have existed over a long term, or have lived for a long time. If these states have been co-opted by the worst, then we have no reason to believe that these states have any sort of legitimacy. And in fact, they must regularly show proof that they are not co-opted by the worst in order to have any air of legitimacy at all. For instance, they must demonstrate that there is no minority that they're parasitizing off of, including, like, rich people or things like that. It's worth noting that there is no modern state that in the world that does this, that actually has the approval of practically everyone. They all work on these very narrow majorities, and because of that, it is perfectly reasonable to conclude that they are not legitimate organizations. And so, by going over this essay over and over and over again, you can kind of realize that, oh, wait, even though the conclusion of the whole book is kind of squishy about states and blah, 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 like this particular chapter, if you read it and you really understand it, it pushes you toward voluntarism or anarchism, however you want to call it, something like that. So this is not only like an exceedingly important essay to read, it is also an essay that I cite all the time, basically whenever someone pretends that the state is some kind of good organization. You can immediately point at this essay and say, I doubt that your state is a good organization, and here is why. So that's essay number 2. Now the third essay is probably Hayek's most important economic essay. It is The Use of Knowledge in Society. It is probably my second most frequently cited Hayek essay. And it isn't, well, I'm kind of understating it if what I say is that it's an expansion of Mises' conclusion from his 1920 paper called Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, right? Mises' conclusion in that paper was more about actual state ownership. And his conclusion is somewhat hard to pin down sometimes on when actual damage becomes significant, right? Because in Mises' conclusion, if there's a socialist state, it can still do fairly well if it just uses, world market prices and pretends that those are the prices with which it has to plan things, right? And then Mises also was very hesitant to call a state socialistic unless, for instance, so much of the means of production were owned by the state that you couldn't have a functioning stock exchange, something like that. Now, Hayek's expansion, coming 30-ish years after Mises' 1920 paper, shows that every layer of central planning hurts, that every regulation that doesn't actually address a real tort situation makes the economy bleed just a little bit more. It is a total answer to schemes that want to move resources from the private sphere to the public sphere and treat this as something beneficial or, benign. That would be people like Kenneth Galbraith or modern monetary theory. Both of those pretend that moving resources from private hands to public hands doesn't really hurt, or maybe even helps. And of course, this essay by Hayek totally dismantles that argument. So, extremely important paper. Little less to actually kind of yammer on about for it, so let's move on to number 4, which is the meaning of competition. Now, this is another important one, and it maybe even is underappreciated, because what it teaches us is that it's important not to fall for like the words that are in technical names and confuse the words in technical names jargon for the actual words that we would use them in general English, right? The Patriot Act is an example of this, but perfect competition is the example that Hayek tackles in this particular essay. Perfect competition doesn't mean it is the best for everyone. It means that it fits the model perfectly, where the model is a highly simplified supply demand triangle, deadweight losses kind of thing, that is based on knowledge that nobody actually has. Nobody knows what the shape of a demand curve is, or the shape of a supply curve is. Nobody knows for sure where they actually cross. And because we don't have this information, and the only way to get this information is to actually make transfers, to do exchanges, we can never get to the point where we know what these things are. And in the path of getting there, we're going to change conditions enough that probably they'll move around. It's a moving target that you're blindfolded as you chase after anyway. It's not something that you can rely on for how reality is going to work. In fact, the conditions that perfect competition requires would actually forbid people from using the various methods that they have to move toward more efficient uses of resources. And that's what we want, efficient uses of resources. And so the idea of perfect competition prevents things like branding, undercutting the competition, improving your methods, etc., etc., etc. These are all things that are not part of that model, and therefore they're not taken into account in the idea of perfect competition. It also requires perfect knowledge or perfect information, which is something that we can never hope to have. And so to pretend that this is some kind of thing that we should aim for is foolhardy at best. It also ignores entrepreneurship, which is something that a lot of pro-state economic theories like to do. It likes to say, oh, we don't need to worry about entrepreneurship. All these problems are already solved. We just, need to match productivity with consumption. Happy days. Hayek's discussion about perfect competition helps us understand that entrepreneurship is actually a very important part of the economy, and to get rid of it when you still need it is to actually end up going off into some random direction where you end up, losing a bunch of stuff because you think this is the efficient use for a thing, when actually efficient use is something else that an entrepreneur might be able to figure out. It's also worth noting that in order to achieve the requirements of perfect competition, you would need a totalitarian state that would do certain things like prevent speech, branding, or things like that. And if once you build a totalitarian state, the chance that it does these things to reach perfect competition is basically zero. There's no chance that once you give this much power to a group of people, that they would go off in this supposedly beneficial direction. They would, of course, use it to enrich themselves. The fact that you can never accomplish the perfect knowledge that is necessary for perfect competition is another reason why you really shouldn't bother aiming for it when you actually have things like entrepreneurship, profit, and loss that are real signals that you can use to determine whether you're using efficient resources more or less efficiency, and allow you to measure that over time with real numbers that you can actually measure. So yeah, this fourth essay is super important. And of course, the lesson that we learn is that just because they call it perfect competition doesn't mean it's something that we should aim for. That the things that we would lose in aiming for it might be worse than the difference between where we are now and where perfect competition might be. So that applies to a lot of things where it has a really nice name, but actually the results are not as good as you expect. So that's the fourth essay. Now, the fifth essay is called The Non-Sequitur of the Dependence Effect, and this is an essay that's taking apart Galbraith's dependence effect idea. In short, Galbraith basically says something like this: that the only wants that are actually important or that are necessary to be fulfilled are those which are experienced spontaneously by the individual left to himself. Other wants are less or unimportant. Hayek notes, and I believe correctly, that this is a complete non sequitur. Practically all wants that you have are related to some outside information that you get from somebody else. That includes all of art, all of music, all of literature. Most of the things that we enjoy in civilization that keep us out of mud huts are things that we don't know about unless we know that they exist and someone else has told us about it. It ignores the long chain of entrepreneurial decisions that has gotten us to where we are today. Kind of assumes that where we're at is somehow natural, or what it does, and what Galbraith actually did with it, was it said, oh, well, what we need to do is we need to take a bunch of resources out of the private sphere and put it in the public sphere to help achieve these so-called more important spontaneous wants. Most of the things that allow us to build up resources and capital to give ourselves a meaningfully comfortable life are things that, by Galbraith's argument, are unimportant and should be ignored. Of course, this is not the conclusion that Galbraith wants us to make. Galbraith wants us to have kind of a status quo bias, where, what we have now is good enough. And so now we're just going to give everything else out to this other thing and ignore the possibilities that further gains could be made. It's a foolish mistake, and Hayek helps to elucidate it in this essay. Number 6, The Pretense of Knowledge. Now, this is an essay based on Hayek's Nobel laureate speech. It is a desperate plea to the know-it-alls in governments all around the world to recognize their limits and to recognize the limits of the knowledge that they actually have or could get, right? It discusses the inherent limits of economic data as a thing and the need for actual thought, or what Mises would call theory, as opposed to chasing spikes in the noise or strange trends that aren't really isolated in a meaningful way. He talks about the difference between unorganized complexity, which is like the world of physics, right? A billiard ball doesn't care which way it goes. It simply does what the forces around it demand it do, versus organized complexity, which is the social sciences, according to Hayek. So, a billiard ball can never be spiteful, but a man or a group of men can. And that's the basic idea to get from there. Another point that Hayek makes that I think is really important is that he talks about the adoption of mathematical methods that were proposed by Pareto and a few others, and to adopt those methods without paying attention to the inherent limits of those methods, which were in fact recognized by Pareto and his colleagues when they were coming up with these ideas. So, it's one of those essays that really helps break down the difference between scientific knowledge and economic knowledge, and why economic knowledge relies more and should rely on logical theory as opposed to, numbers go burr. There's a lot of different reasons why numbers could go burr, and if you don't use logic and understanding to isolate or try to isolate the reasons why it did, then you're likely to make a bunch of mistakes because there's a bunch of phenomena happening at the same time. And, the things that you're dealing with are not mindless billiard balls. They're people that react to things in sometimes unpredictable ways. So that's essay number 6. The final essay is called Choice in Currency, A Way to Stop Inflation. And this is one of Hayek's essays about the problems of monopoly money. Monopoly money. It's short and it's persuasive, and it examines the problems of both monopoly and fiat monies, and that's a little better. It's kind of like Rothbard's What Has the Government Done to Our Money, but a little calmer than Rothbard usually is. I mean, in this essay, Hayek covers things like the real consequences of a state monopoly on money and how these problems are caused by the fact that the government forces you to deal in this particular money. And, if you want to solve these problems, an easy way to do this is to let people, deal in terms and in monies or currencies that they prefer, right? It allows us to, get a better idea of what currencies are doing well and then to understand maybe why or why they aren't. It's one of these things where there's this massive, network or web of regulations on top of a whole big chunk of the economy. And everybody says, well, we need this web, otherwise everything would go wrong. But the actual fact of the matter is that if you got rid of the web entirely, right? If you just got rid of the whole thing, that people making voluntary choices would solve most of these problems by themselves and in a voluntary way. There's no reason to resort to this vast web of guns pointed at people's heads in some kind of horrible, gigantic Mexican standoff when you could just let the market work, and the market would make things work. And in addition, it would get rid of some of the bad things that government does when it takes control of the money, like inflating and basically ripping away the people's wealth from themselves. One really cool thing in this essay that I think is worth highlighting is that in it, Hayek takes a look at a very subtle misapplication of Gresham's law. Gresham's law is in short, is that bad money forces out good. And Hayek notes that that there have been people who have looked at certain things that have happened in the world of exchange, right? And said, oh, people did this instead of doing this, and that's like the opposite of Gresham's law. And Hayek says, no, wait a minute, because Gresham's law only applies when two different types of money are forced to exchange on some kind of level. If you force both gold and silver to be legal tender, and you force gold and silver to exchange at some constant or arbitrary exchange ratio, what's going to happen is that the people are going to hoard the thing that's worth more, and they're going to exchange the thing that's worth less. That's Gresham's law. If you have a situation where there's a really bad money and people start trading liquor instead, that's not Gresham's law, because the money and the liquor are not being forced to exchange at this arbitrary ratio, and therefore the market can solve the problem of fluctuating values. So that's a very interesting point in that essay, and that point itself is, I think, reason enough to read that, just to get Hayek's perspective on that. So that's the 7 essays in this book. It's a short book. It's not super long, and that's nice, because Hayek is a bit of a slog to read sometimes. He is a difficult read. The next section is an annotated bibliography, which, usually I would say, oh, it's just a bibliography, fine. But it turns out that the Mises Institute got David freaking Gordon to do the annotated bibliography for a list of Hayek's works. And so you get a list of books written by Friedrich Hayek, and the reasons why you might want to take a look at these books and what these books cover is handled by the walking grandmaster encyclopedic genius that is David freaking Gordon. So, this is a great way to figure out, if you want to read more Hayek, where your interests might lie. And so, as opposed to a lot of bibliographies where I say, well, it's just a list of books, I would say this is a list of books plus David Gordon's wisdom. So worth a look. And then finally, I won't say much about it because it's an index, but I will note that, every section of this book had someone, to work on it. Most of it was Hayek, but we had Tom DiLorenzo, we had David Gordon, and the index was kindly created by Roger E. Bissell and helps you to figure out where certain topics that are discussed in the book are discussed in the book, which is nice for a hard copy. So yeah, thanks to the Mises Institute for putting this collection of essays together. Thanks to them for sending one to me. Sorry I didn't quite get this done in time for the end of the fall fundraising drive, but I started reading it and I was like, this is only 100 pages. It should take me an hour to read. I'm like, no, it's 100 pages of Hayek. It's more like 4 hours to read. So yeah, but still, extremely good book. Lots of really important essays. I cannot recommend this enough, especially because it is free. So go get a copy at the link that's in the description, and enjoy some of Hayek's greatest hits. All worth reading, all giving important and different points about economics that people need to remember, including, the seed to anarchism that is why the worst get on top. So yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like this channel, if you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. Links in the description, all that good stuff. And I will say, have a good weekend, and I will see you next time. Probably with the end of Rousseau's, the Rousseau critique. God, it'll be good to be done with that. Okay, cool. All right, we will talk later, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.